I'm Jennifer Brinkmann. I'm president of Alive and Well Communities and thrilled to be here with everyone today. This is the April Learning Community Session for Alive and Well, and we're continuing our conversations of resolutions for community healing. We began this conversation on this topic back in December with our friends in Kansas City when we were in space at the Mohart Center. And since then, we've really continued that conversation, most recently with some of our founders of the Cultural Competency Collective of Greater Kansas City, because we know we can't understand where we're going until we understand where we've been. And so we thank everyone for being here with us, especially welcoming our friends from the St. Louis Regional Health Commission and the advisory boards and board members that have joined us today with our friends in Kansas City, as well as those who've joined us from Southeast Missouri. Qiana's time's limited with us today, so we're going to jump right into the conversation. After Angela and Qiana talk, we're going to have reactions from some of our partners in our 3 regions of St. Louis, Kansas City, and the Boot Heel. And again, we want to make the most of our time. So we're going to put things in the chat throughout that link to things like Angela and Qiana's bios, so you can see those and not spend our time reading those. And most recently, both Health Forward Foundation and the Regional Health Commission restated their strategic purposes, all with a focus on advancing health equity and racial equity. So we'll put links to those in the chat as well. And we'll get started in just a second. I do want to thank our funders for this event, the Jackson County Community Mental Health Fund, Reach Healthcare Foundation, and Health Forward Foundation are funding this workforce in Kansas City and have been great partners in this work along the way. So we thank them again for their support today. With that, we're going to turn to Qiana and Angela and begin this conversation around how we bridge this work in the state and how do we advance health justice and health equity across Missouri. And we know that we live in very difficult and challenging times. We know the legislative environment that we're in right now. Yet we have these 2 great leaders and all the individuals on this call who are working to advance equity. So my first question for them, and we'll start with you, Qiana, is what can you share as an example of something that's going well, that gives you hope that we can get to this vision of health equity, health justice, and zero health disparities?
Sure. Good morning, and thank you, Jennifer. I am really grateful to be in space, albeit virtual, with you all this morning. I don't know about you, but I've not done a lot of virtual panels for the past year and a half. So I feel like I'm going backwards a little bit, but it's as good as time as any to share a statewide space. So thank you for the important question. I was just remarking to Angela and Lester and others that we don't do enough statewide work together. And at this point, that is what it's going to require to address systems change, which is what Health Forward is focused on. So before I get to the crux of the question, Health Forward Foundation is focused on building inclusive, powerful, and healthy communities characterized by racial equity and economically just systems. We believe that those 2 factors are the best and most viable and maybe even the most credible pathways to health equity, as what undergirds health inequity is economic exclusion and not race, but racism. And so those are the 2 pathways that we employ to create both health and wealth for the communities that we get to be in community with. You know, at this point, the work and the opposition to the work is so formidable that if we do not address things as a state in a systems fashion, we'll just be playing whack-a-mole, right? Issue after issue is popping up. And all the anti-this and anti-that legislation that's occurring in our state. We had anti-DEI budget language attached to the final budget for Missouri. The fact that it got that far should cause us to just want to throw everything, right, at the wall with respect to systems change and working together. When we see healthcare popping up for LGBTQ and trans identities, that should infuriate us. When we see the Do No Harm bill popping up that prohibits, even though it was defeated, they are still happening, and the fact that they're progressing should cause us great alarm. So we have to be that much more strategic and deliberative and play the long game. And the only way, in my view, to play the long game is to focus on policy and civic engagement statewide in a very coordinated fashion. So a lot of our resources, investments, political will, sweat equity is channeled around civic engagement and coalition building, not only in Kansas City, but across the state. We are supporting the Missouri Inclusive Democracy Fund that will focus on engaging Black and Brown communities specifically in nonpartisan voter registration, not focusing on issue specific. We want to create and engage citizenry that is educated on the issues, is registered to vote, and is given enough information about what's at stake so they can activate the power that they already possess. And so we are supporting that in collaboration with several other actors across the state. I won't name names because I'll leave somebody out. And some of you are here in this room. But I think it's the best thing that we can do right now to address health justice in a way that provides an undergirding to the policy attacks that are creating the health inequity. Yes, there's work to do in actual clinical care, and we're still addressing that in many ways. There's work to do in all the areas of the social influences of health, which I'm sure we'll get to. But civic engagement, in our view, is the new super social influencer of health. If we don't have that engagement, we won't get far.
Thank you, Qiana. And Angie, I know we've talked too about this game of whack-a-mole that we feel like we're playing and the strategies to get to the bigger picture. Can you talk about the things that give you hope that we are making progress and that we can get there?
Yeah, and I love everything Qiana just said. A lot of the conversation that we've been having around the Regional Health Commission as well in our tables, and just kind of how we have repositioned ourselves as an organization. For the first 20 years of our existence, we really focused on ensuring access to those who are uninsured and underinsured, ensuring they had coverage to receive care and access through our safety net system. As we have expanded Medicaid with all the work that went into getting that passed and implemented, we have shifted our focus to really think about how do we get to a place of zero health disparities by bringing together our system leaders that have historically been around our table with those who have that lived experience and the impacted populations at the table together to really bridge the gap in some of those issues and help us resolve this, develop solutions to get to those zero health disparities. And as we think about that, it's I've told the team just what Qiana said, like we're working for that long game. We're standing in the midst of a wildfire that's happening around us. And with all these different legislations that Qiana just mentioned, we keep going after these campfires, right? And so how do we get in front of that to really think about some of those political determinants of health that really got us to where we are in terms of our disparities and inequities that we see in our community? And so what really gives me hope around that is just this conversation of seeing more people get engaged in the civic place. As we think about it, you know, we've been labeling it as a policy 101 with our community. And how do we begin to bring along those who are in these communities, right? And connecting what's happening in the legislative process with their everyday lives so they really understand how these legislations are impacting their day-to-day. A lot of the cycles that they see of trying to, address food, transportation, jobs, and housing really deals with a lot of the policies and the anti-legislation that we see coming out of our different political spaces. And so engaging in that. And so I'm just excited about that conversation and how it's beginning to happen across several organizations that understand that need to begin addressing policies. And really not just chasing after what's being entered, but how do we begin to create the policies that we are seeing and the solutions that we want to see implemented in our communities. And using those with that lived experience to be the voice to help reach that and engage in that space and do the voting and the development of that language that we want to see. Other things that give me hope, and I always think about the pandemic as like this really turning point of where we saw a lot of people say equity, right? I think after Michael Brown that we saw many people adjusted their missions, their visions to include equity without really understanding what it meant and how to see it in action. And so after the pandemic and all that happened in that kind of span of time, we really saw more people that shift of what I say, that shift in power, that redistribution of resources to really start seeing equity in action. And some of the spaces I've seen that and have been excited is the change in leadership. When we think about that shift in power, those who are at the table, how do we have our leadership begin to resemble the populations that we're trying to serve? And a lot of the tables and the seats that have shifted have been women, and in particular the Black women that have been engaged as part of the leadership and some of the power dynamics that we've seen. I know it across several organizations in St. Louis, and I'm sure in other places as well. And just understanding that the caretakers, the gaps that need to be filled, having those voices at the table to be a part of it, to help push, to think differently about collaboration, creating that diversity has been impactful for not only, I think, the individual organization, but also the system themselves to have those new faces at the table to really think about how we get to this space of zero health disparities. And then the other thing I would say is kind of exciting is begin to see the shift in resources, right? And how do we think about where do we fund the social determinants of health? How do we fund equity and those type of things? And when we look at our hospitals, and particularly, and I like to highlight them because I remember when I started at the commission many years ago, the conversation, I came in to do behavioral health work. And I remember the conversation at the table was, why are we even focusing on behavioral health? We do clinical stuff. That's not something that can be addressed clinically. That's in the environment. That's not something we can be talking about. And over the last years, just the priorities that they have elevated to be outside of the doctor's walls, be outside of that clinical space, and really thinking about economic justice, where we've seen hospitals think about using their investments to fund Black and Brown business owners. They're thinking about food, right? And so they're partnering with many of our food banks to offer food into the people that they serve and have those things available on site. They're thinking about housing. They're even thinking about mental health and behavioral health differently, right? So substance use, where they've created different resources in the community to be able to address that and do actual investments in that space. And as they think about their actual community health improvement priorities, they're listing these things out as priorities. And we all know gun violence is an issue, and many of our hospitals have thought about how do they begin to address and engage in those efforts. So, I think as we've seen the shift of understanding equity, naming it, right? Racial equity, we name it, we're naming justice, but then to actually see it in action. And we have a long way to go, but I think we've made a lot of first steps to get us there. And again, by really thinking about how do we begin to shift power, right? And then how do we begin to shift our resources in the way we fund differently?
Qiana, is there something you want to add to that?
I would, and I appreciated the comprehensiveness of all the spaces and intersections that Angela mentioned. Another that is very much a promising practice that gives me great hope in Kansas City is the Kansas City Health Equity Learning and Action Network. It's a network of 52 organizations that comprise the healthcare ecosystem. So yes, we do know that there's a lot of social and political influencers of health outside of the clinical space, but that does not mean that we forsake the clinical space. And so this is comprised of health systems, independent hospitals, our health plans, our public health departments, our community-based organizations. We even have one employer, as they are the larger payer of health care services, which is Nebraska Furniture Mart, participating. The whole focus is to help build championship capability and capacity in the organizations to focus on health equity as a strategic priority in their organizations, that they're budgeting and resourcing for it, and that they are developing shared language, shared understanding, and that we have collective goals as a community and an ecosystem to work on together. A few of the goals that we just collected some baseline data on is around diversifying the boards and the C-suites of our healthcare ecosystem. To the ticket of entry for the Learning in Action Network was a CEO commitment and attestation where you had to agree to diversify your board with people of color underrepresented in health. So not the broader sense of diversity that includes a lot of identities, as it should, but we also know that to address the greatest health inequities in healthcare, that we need to have people of color underrepresented in health professions and decision-making bodies and tables to be able to redistribute and rebalance power. So that was one of the goals that as a system we are focused on, because we know the trickle-down impacts of that will be significant. So all of those 52 organizations agreed to make health equity a strategic priority. 15 of them agreed to take more concrete action steps and are wrapping up an action cohort that's been 12 months long in June. They have prioritized different things like racism as a public health crisis in Wyandotte County, focusing on race-based algorithms at University Health and eliminating that, which is our safety net, high-quality safety net. Medical Health Center, most of you might know it as Truman on the St. Louis side. Many are focused on community health workers and ensuring that the CHWs are integrated into their care models as a table stake and a mainstay. Those are just a few examples that cross community clinical spaces that a few of the organizations that are participating have prioritized. So we're looking forward to sharing some learnings and insights. We've been working on this. It's been in flight for 2 years, and we're wrapping up that action cohort, and we look forward to sharing that with the community. And we've begun to vision and project ourselves into the future in terms of what we want this to be going forward. And really, really gives me hope to see the zeal and the fire that folks are catching and keeping in Kansas City as just the way that Kansas City does healthcare and business going forward. So good hope with that.
No, that's all exciting. I sit here and I listen to both of you, and I think we really do have a reason to be hopeful moving forward, even when there's days when it feels like there's not a lot of hope. So thank you for bringing that into the space. I'm going to jump ahead in the conversation to talk a little bit about our rural communities. Both of you have put stakes in the ground to say we can't do this without bringing in our partners from rural Missouri. And if you could just speak for a moment about how you envision us bridging that divide and what can unite us in doing this work rather than divide us. And Qiana, if you want to start.
Sure. Well, and last year, Health Forward took the step that we had never taken before to determine who we are prioritizing. And health equity, you really can't be effective without putting a stake in the ground in terms of who are you centering. And so we determined that people of color and rural communities are the communities of focus for us. While people of color deal with structural racism, our rural communities have always dealt with structural urbanism, policies and decisions and structure that favor urban communities over rural communities. And so helping to educate all of our legislative friends in our state to understand the decisions they make oftentimes have metrics and regulations that are tied to population that automatically disinvest, not invest in our rural communities. So that's why we are prioritizing things like digital equity, where we are supporting broadband as a public utility, where we are supporting policies and partnerships with both of our states as we serve Missouri and Kansas around both policies and capital stacks that will advance greater broadband or broadband at all, getting to our rural communities like we enjoy here in our urban centers. And helping our rural health systems stay viable and stay open. We are even challenging ourselves. I just talked with my team yesterday. Philanthropy has this tendency to say we only focus on this. And what I'm learning, because we learn from all of our communities every day, is that doesn't work well for most folks because our lives are intersectional. But in rural communities, you kind of have to adopt a place-based focus and not just say we only focus on housing or we only focus on healthcare or digital equity. While those are our priorities and we might invest deeply in those areas, our perspective and our toolkit has to be much broader because the setting is just different. And we don't want to perpetuate the structural urbanism by being so focused that we do our rural communities a disservice. So we're learning and growing ourselves in that area right now, which I'm happy that we're on that journey and progressing. So those are just some of the areas that I call out that we're focused on. The other thing is housing. And what we've heard in our rural communities, because we're also focused on health sciences workforce, is health sciences workforce would be great. We need a workforce that's diverse in rural communities, but we don't have anywhere to put them. If we get them here, we can't house them. So hearing from them helped us understand that if we want to do health science workforce in rural communities, it has to be housing based, workforce housing. And so that's the intersectionality that learning from the communities has helped us begin to bridge and calibrate the strategies that we thought would be viable, and learning from the communities aren't as viable as we thought.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Angela?
Yeah, so at the Regional Health Commission, we have mostly done our work within the St. Louis region. So St. Louis City and County has been kind of our history of work. And we are newly expanding this idea of how do we begin to expand the work across the state. And this has been really centered around our policy work. And thinking about a lot of what we are seeing, it feels like we're at odds with our neighbors and our friends across the state in rural and this divide between urban and rural areas. And how do we begin to think from that political space of bridging that gap to understand that we have more in common than what we think. And a lot of the issues that we're addressing in many of our urban areas are similar to what is addressed in our rural areas. And as Qiana stated, it looks differently there. But again, when we think about transportation, when we think about the health deserts, food deserts, we think about gun violence, which MFH did a great convening, a state convening a few weeks ago that really looked at the data and saw that gun violence is happening across the state, right? It's an issue that we're all facing, we're all addressing. And how do we begin to come together, again, with this collaborative spirit of let's work together to really get to address these issues so that we can really play this long game as a state and not keeping what feels like a divide between our urban and rural spaces and working together to really bring about that cohesiveness to see the change that we want to see. And this really started, and we have similar dynamics happening just within our walls in St. Louis and with some work I've done volunteer in a community that's divided between wards, right? They have 4 wards within the community the first two wards, 1 and 2 wards, feel like they get all the investments, leadership is investing all of the resources there, where their 3rd and 4th wards feel disinvestment, right? They see more trash dumping, they see more homes that need to be fixed and different things. And so just the complete disinvestment in the community. And what happened, they were always voting against each other and fighting in their meetings. But really, when we worked with some organizing groups to bring the wards together, to have conversations, to understand the different issues, they were really work together. In this past election, they were able to change some leadership just by understanding some of the differences they were seeing and some of the similarities that they had across wards, right? And so I just think as we think about how do we move forward our state and some of these political issues and just understanding people, like we're human, right? We have a lot of the same issues. We have the same cares, and how do we begin to bring some of that power together to move the change that we want to see?
Thank you. And I can just say from our perspective at Alive and Well, our partnership with Lester Gillespie and our friends in the Boot Heel, we've learned we have a lot more in common in our regions than we have different. And there's a lot of room for us to do this work together. So I thank both of you for bringing that into the space. Qiana, I know you're on a short timeline this morning, so I want to make sure we hear from you on this last question. We convened a group recently in Kansas City to pilot something called Trauma and DEIBA, Healing Our Workforce, working with leaders in Kansas City who said they want to be part of bringing these two disciplines together. And in space, they named themselves disruptors. They said, we're going to go back and take this information, and we want to be disruptors in our community. And I think a lot of folks who are on this call hold that same sort of ethos of wanting to do this work, but the days can be long and hard. So what do you have for encouragement for these folks, and how can people stay engaged in the work for the long haul to get us to health justice and zero health disparities?
Well, I would say for folks who consider themselves disruptors, to know that your self-care and soul care game needs to be on point because it's very depleting, and the work itself, oftentimes we find joy in it, but sometimes because you find so much joy in it and you feel like it's your purpose, you don't realize when you're tired and when you're exhausted. So first, let me say that, and I've learned the hard way around that. I would say have an unrelenting focus on systems work and not programmatic work. Programs have always been focused on fixing people, and people have never been broken. Our systems are broken. So whatever the priority is that the disruptors are working toward, is to look upstream. What is the upstream or the root cause factor here that needs to be addressed from a systems perspective? And how do we build champions, organizers, and coalitions to support us in this work? So systems versus programmatic focus. The other thing that I feel like Angela alluded to is really engaging the power of narrative and narrative change. So much of what we have been conditioned to think and to speak about those we serve has been shaped by this very deficit framed language. On this, on that. I worked with my board to take uninsured and underserved out of our mission. I don't know about you, but if I'm being introduced to a community, I don't want anybody to say on this, vulnerable, at risk before they say Qiana. I want them to say she's powerful, she's smart, she's this and she's that, and then describe my need, right? But not in a deficit way. And I think as a social sector, we've been so trained to focus on describing the need that we have perpetuated these very harmful narratives of who we serve. And we know that narrative shapes belief, belief shapes and colors policies, and from that resources flow. And so we need to be very mindful of how we are speaking about who we serve. And we oftentimes can create these austere environments where we feel like we are fighting for resources when we really have abundance. And so this scarcity mindset that we hear from our legislative bodies, that there's not enough to go around, and we know that there is. So finding language that bridges divides between communities, that focuses on abundance and the things that we all need and not scarcity, and describes the communities that we serve by their strength, their contributions, and their assets first. It doesn't mean that we're ignoring their need. It's just rewiring our brain and how we choose to speak about them. And the power of that is important. So we're doing a lot of investments in narrative change and narrative power, especially around Black and Brown leaders in our communities, so that we can begin to shift that. So I would offer those encouragements to the disruptors.
Thank you. And I just want to acknowledge what you and Angela both said about the shifting of power and how that happens by changes in leadership, but also shifting those narratives and how we begin to tell a story differently to center power in different places. So thank you for elevating that. Angela, when you think about how we sustain in this work, what comes to mind for you?
And just want to say thank you, Qiana. It has been a pleasure, and I know we're going to get together and have a great powwow following this. But I do agree with ditto to everything Qiana just stated, right? And the self-care, I feel like she copied my words. Like self-care is important here. I remember when the anti-language first came out, and I was just like, I don't even know how we get up and go to work, right? That self-care, the remembering the why. And why we're here, why we're doing this is very important to hold on to as we do this self-care, because I don't think this is the worst of what we're seeing, right? It's going to continue to happen, but how do we begin to remember why we are centered in this work and the people that we are working in partnership with to get to that thriving, successful communities we want to see, right? Really holding on to that. And I think that was just important. So the restatement of that self-care to continue this fight, because we have a fight. We're up in the, as I said, we're fighting a wildfire, right? And everything that happens, we keep trying to go after these campfires that's gonna wear us out, right? And so how do we begin to hold on to what keeps us here? I also say celebrate the small wins. We're fighting a war, but we're winning some battles. We're leveling the playing field. And so how do we begin to celebrate those wins as they happen and taking a moment to pause and say, hey, we accomplished this. And so, I got the update yesterday that the Senate did take out the anti-DEI language, right? And so how do we celebrate that? And the letter that the organization put together, the sign-on letter, over 200 organizations signed the letter and really had a strong voice behind this is not good for our state. And so being able to celebrate those wins as they're happening and taking time to just pause and say we've done it before we move into the next one. Because again, we're fighting a war. And so the battles do make a difference that we do accomplish. And my last thing is just keep fighting the good fight. We are here because we care. We are here for the communities that often are this service. They're not getting the resources. We want to create the wealth. We want to see the power. We want to see the activation. We want to see people being able to choose how they live and have the things that they need when they need them. And I say that's our long-term goal. And rethinking how we use our language. I love what Qiana said about taking out that uninsured, underserved. I've been marginalized. Every time I hear, I'm like, we're not marginalized people, right? How do you begin to change that language to really celebrate the assets that we have in our communities that already exist and really using that to get us to the next level. Because we have little ones, right? That next generation. And I know there was a question about the education and why REC is partnering with Alive and Well and thinking about how do we engage in the education system, because we know that is the future, right? Those kids, and we need to get further upstream in this conversation to think about how do we prevent these outcomes that we're seeing today. And we can't keep starting at the end, which is important. We want people to live long, healthy lives, right? And we understand that, but our healthcare system is based on sick care. By the time we get there, your issue are far worse than what they could have been had you had that preventive care up front. And so how do we get that education? How do we get that healing into our space and really rephrasing how we think about kind of this mental health, behavioral health issues, and really say addressing this trauma and healing for our communities, so that we can get to like this long-term space that we want to see. So those would be my key points for this.
Thank you, Angela, and thank you, Qiana. I think you've really inspired all of us this morning to keep going, and we know, we can get to healed communities where we do all have the chance to be alive and well and live our full potential. So thank you to both of you for your leadership in doing this work and giving of yourselves in this work for all of us. We are very grateful to you. We're going to go ahead and turn to folks in our 3 regions who have been part of doing this work. By Qiana, thank you again. Doing this work with us for a long time, including Lester Gillespie, who's the CEO of the Fresh Start Self-Improvement Center in Charleston, Missouri, and a close friend and partner of Alive and Well's. Laura Sloan, who's the executive director of the Schumacher Family Foundation in Kansas City, and has been a part of advancing equity in Kansas City in multiple roles throughout her career, and been part of the Cultural Competency Collective of Greater Kansas City and its transition to Alive and Well, as well as Risa Rollins, friend and colleague, the Chief Operations and Strategy Officer of the St. Louis Regional Health Commission, who was central to the development of the bold mission and acceptance of the vision for zero health disparities. So I'm just going to start with you, Lester, and just want to hear from you about how this vision of health equity and justice that we just heard about, how that's relevant in the boot heel, and what makes you hopeful that we can get there collectively across our state.
Okay, well, first off, I just want to say that I'm excited about just being part of this discussion. And Angela and what was her name? Qiana? What was her name again?
Qiana.
Yeah, and Qiana, this is hope for our region, and it allows us to be part of a bigger picture. For so long, our region has been, I want to say neglected, but we just didn't have a focus on health equity and health justice and trying to maneuver in such a way in which people are getting served. And I really appreciate Qiana talking about the eliminating the word underserved, underinsured, because that puts us in an inferior state of mind right off the bat. I mean, individuals in some cases, that's why they continue to keep us there, because we come in feeling inferior. We come in addressing ourselves in a very inferior state of mind. So I'm excited about being able to eliminate that kind of language. I also want to know what can we replace that language with. But the other part of that is, I think it's important for you all to know that doing this trauma work has opened up so many doors, gave us a platform to speak from when it comes to health equity, because you can't erase anyone's experience, whether it been dealing with racism, whether it's dealing with poverty, whatever the case may be, whether it be justice in the criminal justice system. What I experienced is what I experienced, and so we had a kind of like a roundtable discussion one time, and we had people that was not of color, not realizing how it impacted the African American community when this happens. And so what ended up happening was we had to kind of slow the meeting down to say we cannot erase anybody experiences because we have to deal with them and they want to deal with them. And so what that trauma lens does, it allows people to be heard throughout the conversation, because so many times we had that conversation, then it skipped over and we move on. But we have to get down into the meat and potatoes of why people feeling the way they feeling. So I'm really excited about this work being done statewide. I'm really excited about it happening in the boot hill, especially because we do have our hospitals need to be educated. But one thing we're doing with the trauma piece is not only are we trying to get our community folks educated on trauma and how it impacts their lives, but we're also educating providers so that they understand how to deal with those issues when you're dealing with people that is being faced with trauma, and how we should be treating them when they come through our door. So it's kind of like we got two things going on at the same time, but it needs to be happening at the same time, because once that happens, then you are in a position to where things can change. And so I just want to say that I am so excited about what we're talking about today. And I just can't, it's like God, you guys are God sent, because we never had an opportunity in our region to be able to openly have these discussions. So I thank you again for allowing me to be a part of this. And I definitely want to be part of this work. And I just believe in this mission, and I'm just so excited about this opportunity. And that's pretty much all I have.
Thank you, Lester. And we share the excitement and passion for being able to bring this work together across our regions, because I think we can hear we have a lot in common. There's a whole lot we can do together. Laura, I know you've been in this work for a while in Kansas City. And as you've watched the landscape change there, and you watch leaders like Qiana and others who are really pushing for health equity and health justice, what do you see happening across Kansas City that gives you hope that we're going to get there?
Thanks, Jennifer. I do see hope, and it's interesting. The Shoemaker Family Foundation funds social justice and environmental justice and education. And my background is child abuse and more social justice. And what I think is interesting is we don't fund health per se, but it's all related, right? You don't have health equity without criminal justice equity and education equity involved. So I think there's growing understanding in philanthropy in Kansas City among funders that these things, you can't separate them out. They're all related. And I also think Angela and Qiana both talked about the shift in power we're starting to see and the shift in resources that go with this. And I am seeing that, it's slower than I would like to see it, but I sort of think of foundations as ships, and the bigger the ship, the harder it is to turn it around. It takes some time. We're a smaller foundation. We have 5 board members, 3 family, 2 are community members. So we're a lot more nimble. And the way we've sort of started to turn things around is to focus on how we can have impact as a smaller foundation in the Kansas City community and the philanthropic community. So we're doing this by more funding of grassroots organizations that are founded and or led by people of color from the communities that they are trying to impact, that they're serving. And I'm seeing more of that. It's very interesting that if you are a huge foundation with an old school board with 20 people, it's a little harder to get that ship turned around. But I see it happening. And Qiana heads up a big organization, and she's certainly turning things around. So I'm optimistic about the role that philanthropy can play in this, understanding that educating people at all levels, people who have had the power to share the power. That's a really important piece in health equity and every other kind of equity.
Thanks, Laura.
Yeah.
And finally, Risa, I know you're going to give us some words today. In terms of getting to zero health disparities, when the Regional Health Commission in St. Louis adopted that vision, was no small thing. And that is a big gain, I know, for that body to adopt that. But when you look at the ecosystem in St. Louis and across our state, what gives you hope that we're getting there, that we're going to get there. This isn't just something words on paper. We're getting there.
I love this question. You, the collective you in the room that are willing to have this really critical conversation. I'm all about intersectionality. And for me, this is a beautiful confluence of all the ways that our lives intersect, and for us to acknowledge that we are holistic beings, and that when you squeeze the balloon on one end, it's going to pop out on the other end. So we need to think of all of these things together. So people who are willing to have those conversations and to engage in what I have lovingly titled our season of failing forward. So what I have learned is that there are a lot of people who will theoretically agree with you. Who's going to say no to health justice? Like we know that health justice is where we need to get. I am excited about the fact that we're no longer stopping with saying reducing stigma. That's not enough. We are actually saying it full-throated, boldly, that anything less than 0 health disparities is not enough. Because even in those dwindling statistics that we like to pat ourselves on the back for, every number represents an individual, a family, a community, and we all are implicated in that. I'm excited about transitions in leadership where there are bold, thoughtful leaders who are willing to own the ways in which the systems that we are all a part of and implicated in have been designed to advantage some and disadvantage others, to identify where the system is working as designed to the detriment of us all, and to set stakes in the ground to say this is not okay. And we are going to partner with community to co-create and co-design systems that work for all. That for me is exciting because I see it happening. I see new leadership when we talk about the Regional Health Commission, when we talk about the City Department of Health, when we talk about the St. Louis County Department of Public Health, and I can go across the board, a lot of different organizations. I jokingly say often that this is not your mama's RHC, but it's not your mama's region, it's not your mama's fight, it's not your mama's state. We really are interested in that radical, I like to borrow this term from our friends at Forward Through Ferguson, that radical collaboration that really invests in shared power and accountability with the wisdom that exists in community to co-create and design the solutions. We at the RHC historically, so we don't throw the baby out with the bathwater, right? Historically, we've been really good at systems and at partnering with systems, at engaging systems, at aligning systems and encouraging incremental change. What I'm really excited about is that we are building our muscle at being in partnership with communities so that our tables look different and our panel of experts include the expertise and is centered and grounded in the expertise that already resides within the communities who know what the issues are, because I live it every day, and who have ideas around this is how we're going to fix these situations. So when we have those conversations, when we have our community members who know by living, our direct service frontline boots on the ground providers across the health and social safety net systems, right? Who are there providing resources and support to say, no, that's not going to work. And let me tell you why, because when I see people every day, here's what I'm hearing, here's what I'm seeing. And we combine that with where we already were kind of good at and getting the leaders and the policymakers and the purse string holders at the table, but them not being the center and focal point of the conversation, including all the best evidence and research, and then understanding that that evidence and research does not come without historic implications, y'all, that we need to be smarter about the evidence and research and understand whose voices are heard, centered, and left out of the evidence and research, and devise and develop evidence and research that really is centered and embedded in the communities that we're serving. Then we're going to have a very different conversation. I have seen across my career gradual shifts, but I'm seeing in this moment an acceleration where folks are understanding that we don't have the answers, but we collectively by coming and approaching and engaging with community, not as subjects, but as partners, as leaders, as experts. This is how we engage in, I like to call, the creative destruction and the co-creation of systems that are designed to work for everyone. And I believe with every fiber of my being that we will continue to see change, and the small change that we'll celebrate in our lifetime, and that in my youngest lifetime will translate into change that is so significant and dynamic that our young ones will say, when they hear stories about how it used to be, that doesn't even seem possible.
Thank you, Risa. I just want to hold that and that possibility that is real, and that all of our young people have that to look forward to. So thank you. Thank you to everyone who contributed to this conversation. We have just a few minutes left where we could take some questions, if there are questions for Angela or other panelists before we adjourn. And I think we have this set up that anyone can come off mute, or we can put it in the chat.
There was a question from Christina earlier for Qiana, but she jumped off. She was just asking for some examples of preferred language. So I don't know if someone can answer that for her. I know Qiana stepped off, so.
And I saw where Qiana was responding in the chat about flipping and talking about the conditions and not the people. I know as an MSW, we talk about people's first language or people-centered language. And so oftentimes the community is not marginalized, the systems, we marginalized the community. And so just being mindful, I think to the transition to a systems focus. And so I like to think about not just the social, but the political determinants of health. That does it allows us to have the conversation in ways that don't let us off the hook. That's not blaming folks who this is the water we swim in and this is what we're breathing. And so we're not accountable. When we highlight that the systems are what's perpetuating harm and that we are a part of the system and have therefore a responsibility to fix it, then I think that puts a different onus on the conversation and the responsibility.
And I will add to that, I did a public health degree. So, you know, the and all of the negative language, I'm recovering as well. And so we think about, you know, empowering, right? People already have power. People have, you know, they have resources, they have assets. I would often think, you know, I grew up poor and I didn't realize I was poor until almost college. And so the statistics that we have and we can ramble off so easily is not people's every day. They're loving families. They care about their kids. They care about their communities. I'm often surprised when people go to many of our what we consider underserved areas, right? Those at-risk people, and they're like, oh, they keep their places so nicely. They're so nice when you talk to them. And it's always that shift of, we think just because of the data and the facts that these are people who don't care or they're making choices not to, right? When we know it's really that they don't have the opportunities because of the way we have created these systems, right? The systems are designed to keep people out and only to serve a certain amount of people. And so I think when we think about the deficiencies, is not with the people, but with the actual communities and the systems and the policies that we have created. And shifting the language to be that. So, you know, I try not to say we're helping people or we're coming in to do this for them, but that really is in partnership. And we're given, and how do we leverage our power to give space and agency for people to do what they need to do?
No, that's right, Angela. We have, I think, a great question in the chat about how do frontline workers who are doing the work alongside individuals and families be part of the system change and not just programmatic responses. Does anyone want to take that?
I like that question. I'll go ahead and take that one.
Yeah.
it feels daunting when you think about the work that you have in front of you and what your responsibilities are, and then think about how deeply embedded the issues we're trying to address are. I always encourage, and when I was teaching, I would always encourage my students to think about what's in your hand, right? What is your knowledge? What is your power, your privilege, and your access? Because it becomes overwhelming when you try to think about changing the whole system at once. But when you start to think about where your sphere of influence is, then that begins to make a difference. When you begin to look for and identify in your day-to-day practice, I'm noticing that this is resonating with certain folks differently than others, and that's an internal policy that we can change. Those closest to the ground, those little p policy changes and influence are significant for the folks that you're serving, and they are what inform the macro systems level change. So being willing to identify where the system is acting as designed and presenting harm, being willing to call it out and to look for strategies and solutions within your sphere of influence and your circle of control, because we all have a part that we can play. That part can grow over time. The other thing I would say is engaging in community groups who are doing the work. I will plug the RHC because it's what I know, because it's where I am, because I love my organization, but we do have Provider Services Advisory Board, a Community Advisory Board, and a Patient Advisory Board that help advise and inform the work that's doing and direct where we focus and prioritize our energy. We have an advocacy policy and advocacy committee where you can sign up for advocacy alerts and follow along with the legislation that has been impacting the communities that we're most interested in elevating and advancing. So those are just a couple of things I would say.
That's great, Risa. And also, Danielle, I know we'll put this in the chat, but we also encourage folks, of course, to sign up to be ambassadors for Alive and Well. That allows you to be in contact with the work we're doing and part of the systems change work. One other question, I don't know if we're going to be able to answer, is about how Health Forward got the commitments to diversify boards. And I'm not sure, Qiana had to step off, and if there are others from Health Forward on the call or not who could speak to that. I'm not seeing anyone from the many faces that are on here. So we'll try to get an answer to that back out to the group. Is there anything else in the chat? Michael, thank you for your comments of thinking about mental health narrowly. I think from Alive and Well's perspective, we've seen the need and the request from community for us to think about mental health much more holistically, and to think about how we get to healing through multiple kinds of therapeutic kinds of relationships and cultures and responses. So yeah, there's a lot of work to do there. Okay, well, I think we're at time. I just want a great big round of applause for our panelists. And yes, Danielle has been on point with the links today. For those who don't know Danielle, she's staff for Alive and Well. She is our new manager of community activation in Kansas City. So everyone in Kansas City, if you don't know Danielle, you will very, very soon. We're super excited about that. Thank you to Qiana Health Forward Foundation, Angela, the Regional Health Commission, Laura, Risa, Lester. We couldn't do this without all of you. Grateful for each of you. We do have an evaluation that I think Danielle put in the chat, if you could fill that out for us. And we will also be following up with an email for you. We also encourage you to register for our next learning community event scheduled in May. So we'll also put that in the chat and send that out to you in a follow-up email. Thank you for spending your morning with us. Go forward and let's carry this work forward together. Thank you.